Thank you. It's my pleasure to be moderating this panel. The infrastructure bill is such an incredible piece of legislation, and I'll just give brief opening remarks, and then we'll go through our panelists, and then we'll save all the questions and comments for afterwards, and you can direct them to whichever panelist you prefer. So just a quick intro on the infrastructure law. It goes by many different names. It was the technical name is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA. But then after it became enacted, they kind of changed the name to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or Bill, BIL. It was signed into law in November 2021. It will deliver about $1.2 trillion worth of federal investments into various levels of infrastructure and things that are kind of related to infrastructure over the next 5 years. It addresses everything from bridges to roads to broadband, water and energy systems. And in the bill, there's a lot of funding for Indian country. Of course, we'll be focusing on one part of that, but just to let you know some of the other parts. There's about $11 billion over 5 years specifically earmarked for Indian country. That includes $3.5 billion for IHS sanitation facilities construction, so like clean water projects, $3 billion to the Department of Transportation for tribal transportation programs, $2.5 billion to address Indian water rights settlements, $2 billion for national telecoms and information administration for broadband connectivity in Indian country. But for our purposes, we're going to focus on forestry and fire. And really, you have an awesome panel here of very important people at different agencies, but all of them converge to work with tribes on forestry, forest management, fire issues. So I really hope you take the opportunity to take note of what they're saying and ask questions, because these are really the gateway people for tribes to be able to harness this historic level of funding over the next 5 years. Before we go, is Pete dialed up on Zoom? Well, while they work on that, I'll introduce him. I will answer Will's question. I wasn't planning to say what my favorite band is because it's kind of weird, but Depeche Mode from the 90s. One fan.
Thought you were going to say Taylor Swift.
No, I gave up Taylor Swift weeks ago. So I'll introduce our first panelist while he's dialing in. Peter Wakeland. Pete currently serves as the Chief Forester for the BIA Office of Trust Services, where he began in 2016. Pete started his career in 1995 as a timber sales forester with his tribe on the Grand Ronde Reservation in Western Oregon. He also spent time as their Natural Resources Director, and their Deputy Executive Officer. After leaving Grand Ronde, he was the Tribal Administrator for the United Auburn Tribe, and then later moved back to Oregon to work for Coquille. You're in here somewhere. And served as their Director of Natural Resources. I would add that Pete was also the very first Hatfield Fellowship Scholar, which his tribe funds young tribal leaders to go back and work in Congress, and that's where we met back in 1999. He was working in one senator's office, and I was in another one, and we got going on Indian forestry way back then. So with that, and I texted Pete to give him a heads up about the band question, so hopefully he got that. There he is. Can you hear me, Pete?
I can hear you.
Okay.
You guys hear me all right?
We can hear you.
All right, good.
So why don't you start with your favorite band and then get into your formal presentation?
There is only one greatest band of all time, and it's Steely Dan. So that's me. And so I will share my screen. I think if Laura had asked me to do this morning, maybe this will be helpful. So with the bill, I'm gonna kind of walk you guys through, what my experience was in trying to manage this thing. There were, a number of different work groups that, and I'm talking specifically for ecosystem restoration because that's mainly what we focused on in forestry. There were other portions of the bill, obviously, that looked at funding for fire. And so I'll go through some of this. And I apologize to the ITC folks. I know that I've showed you some of this stuff before, but I thought it might be good to share with the broader audience. Under the bill in the ecosystem restoration portion, there were, for lack of better terms, there were funding pots under activities. And there were actually 10 activities. So different funding pots in ecosystem restoration. Activity 1, that was a Forest Service funding pot. It had to do with contracts to restore ecological health on federal and tribal lands, really kind of targeting geographic locations, wanting to treat at least 10,000 acres. There's been some more discussion there on really how those geographic locations are defined, but I don't believe we're really all the way there yet, and we'll have to stay tuned on the rest of that. The funding for Activity 1 was not funding for 2022, it'll be in out years. Activity 2, Good Neighbor, darn it, I'm sorry guys, Good Neighbor Authority, BLM, have been talking with them a lot lately. They're interested in getting more tribes to participate in Good Neighbor. And we've talked about some ideas and possibilities to work with tribes under different contracts and utilizing the Tribal Forest Protection Act agreements. Activity 3, that is another Forest Service funding, and I know that we've got Forest Service folks there today. It's one of the ones I'm most excited about. Really hope IA can participate in this one. It's coordination with USDA wood products infrastructure. Activity 4 was grants to states and tribes for voluntary restoration. As it played out on that one, I believe the major focus on Activity 4 was on Hawaiian forest birds and eradication of a mosquito that was killing them. In Activity 5, this was grants to states and tribes for temporary water crossing structures. This is another Forest Service initiative. I'm sure they'll tell you more about it, so I won't spend too much time on that at all. Activity 6, invasive species detection, prevention, and eradication. We did submit projects for this. I think you'll see it in one of the other slides. For 2022, Activity 6, there was funding in there for a number of things, but primarily, again, on the Hawaiian forest birds. It tended to fund things that were specifically focused on eradication of certain species and on the early detection and rapid response system. Activity 7 was restoring, preparing, or adapting recreation sites on federal land, including Indian land. Again, we did do project proposal for this one. And there was, the funding that I saw was, there were some in there for like signage improvements and usage, recreation usage analysis, recreation site, weed infestation mapping, trail system repair, a number of different things, but you're getting the idea here. On Activity 8, funding for restoration and revegetation on mined lands, that is pretty much self-explanatory. And I'm gonna flip my nose. Activity 9, in that funding pot was funding for national revegetation on federal, non-federal, and tribal lands, including the implementation of the National Seed Strategy. It funded projects, included things, it did take into consideration pollinators and the importance there, increased seed production, seed collection, grassland restoration with native seeds. And we did get another project funded in that one, which had to do with tribal greenhouse capacity. There was also one in there, I think, for tribal ecologist capacity. We did get some funding there as well. Yes, I'm just going to briefly kind of go through what we put together. And keep in mind, this stuff was all moving very, very fast. There were a lot of meetings during the weeks to define what really was the intent of the funding, what was allowable, what wouldn't be allowable. And we had to respond to this data call internally within OTS in a very short period of time, about a day and a half, I think is what we had. So we sat down, we really kind of came up with concepts. What would be beneficial for tribes? And so we put these things together. Our activity one proposal was designed to do pre-commercial thinning and planting, 8,500 acres of thinning, 6,500 acres of planting annually over a 5-year planning period. And the intent was to restore ecological health and improve, reduce risk of resource loss, and sometimes total resource loss that we've seen over the last few years with fires. And our total funding request for that was $37.5 million. I'm not sure if we're going to get the funding on this one, but if we do, stay tuned. We'll send out more information. Like I said, there was no 2022 funding allocated, as I recall. Activity 7, the project proposal was focused on really moving money through 638 contracts and self-governance compacts to fund tribal youth crews that would conduct activities to restore, prepare, and adapt recreation sites. Through my own personal experience, I know that my tribe has a youth crew. I'm very familiar with it. I know other tribes do. We've talked at ITC, even in terms of workforce development, that finding ways to get young folks out into the forest doing projects is it's a key component to getting them interested. And so when I saw this, it jumped out to me that this might be an opportunity to do exactly that. And it wasn't funded in FY 2022, but it doesn't mean that there couldn't be funding in out years. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit. Okay. This one, Activity 9, our project focused on updating and expanding tribal greenhouses. There was a lot of talk about focusing mainly on the National Seed Strategy, but we made it known that tribes needed to be recognized in this effort, and the tribes do have greenhouses that provide seedling stock and native plants. And this was a good niche for that. They wanted metrics, so we saw, well, maybe one of the goals should be to double the capacity. Then they could be able to provide conifer trees and native plants and growing stock that could be used in these various different kinds of restoration projects on tribal lands, and could be available for similar projects on federal or non-federal lands. That proposal was at $35 million over 5 years, and it will receive some funding in 2022 but not at the level that we were hoping. I think that with what we're projected to get, I think we can still get a good start on it. What got us thinking about this project proposal really was an expansion of greenhouse operations request that came from a tribe specifically. And at the time, you know, there wasn't, we certainly at central office didn't have funding to do it. When the bill passed, it became pretty clear to me that this was our opportunity to try and push some of that forward, not just for one specific tribe, but for a number of tribes. On that one. This is, I also wanted to mention too, and I missed this slide, I apologize. We had also put in a request, it was about $11 million request to do some LiDAR work. Over the last couple of years, working with some of the fire staff, we put together some LiDAR projects that would have been very beneficial. The initial targets were in the Southwest and in Rocky Mountain region. And at the time, again, you know, we didn't really have the funding at central office to do it. We did put in a supplemental funding request, and it was just too big at the time. The 11 million was too big, so we sized it down. Some of those projects actually have already been funded elsewhere and are underway, but we still want to be able to keep this kind of a request in because we believe this is a really good way to gather a lot of information, not just for forestry and fire, but for range and ag and fish and wildlife. So we're going to keep proposing it. In fact, I answered a data call just yesterday talking about LiDAR. So I know other people are interested in it as well. So in preparing for projects, the 2022 cycle is done, and it's time to really think about the out years, 23 through 26. And I know that it's, like I said, it moved quickly. Information was often hard to get a hold of. And the message I guess I'm passing on is don't be discouraged. There's still time. We've got 4 more out years on this thing, and there's absolutely opportunities to present projects. And there will be more information coming out that'll make that easier to do. I don't know whether or not anybody feels like I was incredibly creative in some of the projects that we proposed from forestry. I thought they made sense, but you know, I think we should be creative in looking at these different kinds of funding pots and bringing something forward that we think fits. Don't be shy about pushing the edge of the envelope. If it fits, it does. If not, you know, we can adjust and move forward. And can ask questions if you're unsure of what's being considered for those funding pots, because it actually could change over time. There will be, you'll probably see, there'll be different kinds of templates for project proposals between Forest Service, DOI, but there is a template that we used internally at BIA that I've been cleared to share that template with folks if that'll help people get started. So if you would like that, let us know and we can send that to you. We don't want people to get hung up on that part of it at all. There's been a lot of capacity or a lot of discussion regarding capacity as tribes look to, you know, get engaged in doing some of these restoration projects. One of the things that may be an obstacle in the beginning is the capacity to get it done. And there was a lot of discussion within the work groups. I know that was sent up to we called it the ERWIG. It was the Ecosystem Restoration Work Group. That was sort of the next level up from the working groups. there was a lot of discussion about capacity and the need for that. And it was agreed upon that we should include capacity building in proposals if that's what's needed. So don't ignore that as you look at some of this stuff. I see a couple of things in the chat, but I'm afraid to switch my screen right now. Submitting projects. In general, if you've got project proposals you want to see go forward, you should submit them to the BIA, and then we'll work with the appropriate work groups and with the IRWIG to make sure that it gets considered. For activity 2, I wanted to just point out on this one, in discussions with BLM recently, if there's a good neighbor project, TFPA project that you want to do with them, it would be best to do your project request and submit directly to the BLM, and then they'll work with us and with districts. That was the way that they preferred it happen. So that was the message I wanted to pass along to you here when it came to activity 2 GNA. And the reason I said they'll provide a context is I believe they're going to make an announcement, but I won't overstep there. The FY 2022 DOI projects that were funded, they can be found on the DOI website. There's, if you go to that, you can click under press releases, and you'll find it. And I know this is a terrible way to display a link, but I'm not that creative. This is the link if you wanted to see what was actually funded in DOI for 2022. Also wanted to mention, this was announced the other day, the America the Beautiful Challenge 2022 request for proposals. But there's about 85 million available in year 1. It has to, it targets restoration of lands, waters, wetlands, wildlife habitat, forest and grasslands, and it expands access to the outdoors, especially in underserved communities. Tribes are considered underserved communities, so if there are these kinds of projects that fit within the confines of America the Beautiful, there's an opportunity to make an ask. Their grant proposals are due July 21, 2022. So I would encourage folks to look at that. It's pretty broad, so could be some possibilities there. You can find information on that at the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation website. Again, there's a tab in there for conservation priorities menu. Then another one for National Fish and Wildlife Foundation programs. And under that, you can find America the Beautiful Challenge, and that will give you more information on that. That is pretty much the end of mine. I did want to go back and say a little bit less, or a little bit more. No, actually, I already covered it. Matt, I know that was less than 30 minutes. I just wanted to give really kind of a summary of what was in the ecosystem restoration portion of the bill, what we had proposed, what was funded, and what the opportunity was going to be in the out years, and to ensure that folks knew that there is opportunity to get funding in out years, and if they need help getting started, we've got a template that we can help them with. Be happy to share that. But that's kind of it for me, Matt. I didn't want to get off into the other pieces of fire and Forest Service, because I know they'll cover it. So okay. I'm good for now.
Thanks, Pete, and I may amend my program a little bit here. It might be good to ask Pete questions now while the presentation's fresh in everyone's memory. Maybe we could do that for up to 10 minutes and then move on to the next speaker, and then we can have follow-up questions at the end for Pete. Does that work for everybody? Do people have questions now, or do you want to wait till the end? We got questions, okay.
Now, the questions will need to come through this microphone.
Works. Yeah, come through this microphone so that Pete can hear you. There's Tim Miller.
Hey Pete, it's Tim from Grand Portage. Say, I'm not really clear on how the money is actually going to make it to the reservation. And I don't know if that's been figured out or if it's going to be answered, you know, from under the other panel members. But, you know, you talk about a project proposal, I mean, but there's no deadlines, there's no framework. Are we just like doing a project and sending it to the regional forester, or how is that working?
There's a schedule that has, you know, it's kind of all on timelines. And I'm not certain that schedule has actually been finalized for 2023, but when it does, we'll make it known. In terms of how the funding's going to move, Tim, there's certain portions of funding that out of some of these pots that were allocated to BIA, and for the projects that we're going to fund, I'm pretty sure that it'll move through 638 contracts and compacts. With DOI and USDA, they may move funding differently, but for us, it's going to be primarily contracts and compacts. It's what we're familiar with. It's easy, and it's generally fast. So that's how we're going to approach it.
It says we're asking Pete to check his chat. Something
Okay.
From Nate.
for a message from Nate. We're close enough. We could do this in person now.
Hey, Pete, so the Assistant Secretary's office is releasing a website in the next few days that's going to address some of those questions about, you know, previous consultations, the POCs for each program. There's going to be a map that's going to show where project funding is going and kind of tracking that progress as well. So stay tuned for this website to be launched by the Assistant Secretary of Interior Affairs office. So just got told that about 15 minutes ago. So.
Good deal. Thank you. Appreciate it, Nate.
Will that include prospective dates and application deadlines, or is it just it's already gone out the door?
There's a lot of placeholders.
Okay.
Yes, there'll be placeholders on that website that I can see right now that's going to address future funding opportunities and like where to send those proposals to, and ideally those templates that we're talking about will also be there. So.
Hello, good afternoon, Pete. This is Victoria Wesley from St. Carlos Forestry.
Hey.
Hi. I was wondering about the funding. Is this funding going to be available to fund equipment, or is it just on salaries when you're doing the project? And how there's no, like the gentleman said, there was no deadline on the projects, but I was wondering, how do we formulate the proposal then, and exactly how will this money, what would it fund equipment? Because most of our projects we need to do on the reservation also requires equipment because we don't have enough staff to.
Right. And I hate to say this, in most cases, I would say no. But we on BIA lands, we are planning to do another rollout on our infrastructure initiative, probably within the next couple of weeks. So there's some opportunities there, but in general, within the ecosystem restoration portion, there's not really funding for equipment. Except for, like supplies, tools, things like that. But if we're talking about rolling stock and things like that, I'm not seeing a lot of opportunities for that.
Anybody else? Oh, here we go. Oh, hands are going up now. You're closest.
Good afternoon, Pete. This is your neighbor, George, down in Coos Bay. How you doing?
Doing good, George?
Hey, Pete, you know we've been working with the Cow Creek Tribe on a project on the Umpqua National Forest. And as long as we do it under the umbrella of TFPA, they're ready to fund the project. Or if they provide funding, it'll be through the annual funding agreement of the Self-Governance Compact. So that opportunity is there as long as it's under TFPA.
Copy. Thank you.
Hey, Pete, this is Tim again. One more, just for clarification. So it sounds like this is all pretty much project-based and not any type of programmatic type funding increase to the reservations?
I'm not sure I understand, Tim.
Well, okay, so if you're talking project-specific versus an increase in, say, I don't like to use it, but like preparedness, your normal budget is going to have just an automatic, kind of a bump in terms of how that comes each year.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you develop the project that you want to do under any one of these different kinds of funding pots, if it's something that's going to require additional resources, staffing, training, that kind of thing, that can all be included in part of your capacity building. So I would say it's both.
And more information on that might come from additional panelists too. Let's do one more question if it's out there, and then we'll keep moving. And if we have time afterwards, we can go back to Pete at the end for questions.
Hi, Pete. This is Kaj Matheson with the Coeur d'Alene Tribe. My question is on activity number 8 for restoration on mining sites. Does that include Superfund sites?
I don't recall that it specifically called out Superfund sites. What it really talked about was funding to restore and rehabilitate like abandoned mine sites. And most of what I saw that was funded under that did exactly that. I did notice that there was a GIS and LiDAR project that got funded as well. Found it a little interesting that it got funded there, but we weren't able to get it funded elsewhere. But it was really targeted at abandoned mine sites. So I'm not sure that Superfund would be precluded. But who knows?
Okay, great. Thanks, Pete. We're going to move on to the next panelist. And like I said, if we have time at the end, we can come back and if people have more questions from Pete's presentation.
Okay.
So thanks. Our next panelist is, the bio says Ketti Spomer, but it's Ketti. Ketti works in the Department of the Interior's Office of Wildland Fire with Jeff Rupert. She is the program manager for the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, so we really should spend lots of time asking her questions. Her role supports the 4 DOI Wildland Fire Bureaus with their investments into the wildland firefighter workforce and their partnerships with tribes, states, and local governments and other organizations. Ketti grew up in the National Park Service and spent 21 years with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Wildlife Refuge System before joining the Office of Wildland Fire in March of this year. So please give a warm round of applause to Ketti, and she'll tell you her favorite band when she gets here.
Hello. So I'm going to cheat and not give you my favorite band, but I will give you my favorite era. I am a child of the 80s. So truly anything that came out of the 80s reminds me of all the damage we did to the ozone layer with our Aquanet hairspray and all of the cheesy love songs. However, my favorite band name is Rage Against the Machine. And I just feel like, even as a bureaucrat, I am my mother's daughter, and I feel like I love to fight against some of the stuff. I won't use bad words, but that also is why I'm super excited about this position with Office of Wildland Fire. Really grateful that I am able to be in this group. I know that there's probably a lot of disappointment that you don't have Jeff Rupert because he's fantastic, but you're stuck with me, and I'm going to be heckling people to remind you all that there is a ton of infrastructure law funding available, not only with what Pete went over, but also through the Office of Wildland Fire and plenty other opportunities throughout the country with the infrastructure law. So I'm just going to throw out a bunch of numbers. I can certainly give you all some better lists later. I think you'll get a copy of the slide deck, but I think the biggest, most important thing is that the infrastructure law is not really prescriptive, especially when it comes to wildland fire. And so much like Pete said, if you have ideas, come up with them. Come up to one of us, talk to me. I will find a way to interpret the infrastructure law to make it work. I feel like there's a lot of opportunities out there, and I think we need to take advantage of them. The funding is available, will be appropriated to us for the next 5 years, but it's available until expended. So, and it's $1.5 billion just in wildland fire alone. So please help me spend that money. So I'm going to jump into my slideshow. Here we go. Oops, sorry. Oh, I've already ruined it. Okay, so the bipartisan infrastructure law, as I mentioned, provides $1.5 billion to the Department of the Interior's Wildland Fire Management Program. The law's funding is intended to prepare communities and ecosystems for the threat of wildfire by making historic investments to address wildfire risk through hazardous fuels management, science and technology to improve the early detection of wildfires, support to local communities to prepare for and mitigate the impacts of wildfires, and post-wildfire restoration activities. Bear, am I right there, Daryl? Yeah. The law also invests in federal wildland firefighter pay and benefit reforms, and in most of these cases, the Department of Agriculture, my friends to the left, we decided that it was safe enough for USDA and DOI to sit that close together without any lightning striking us. They've also received complementary appropriations, and the two departments are collaborating on and coordinating their implementation in as many ways as possible. So under preparedness, tribes can benefit from the following resources that will increase America's preparedness to respond to wildfires. There's $50 million for pre-planning fire response workshops and training for firefighters, and another $50 million for local governments and tribal nations to purchase slip-on firefighting modules for pickup trucks and UTVs. That funding will be transferred over to USDA, and we will be going through the already established program, but there's a lot of money out there for slip-on tanker units, folks, so please apply for those grants. $10 million for radio interoperability and incident management team support when responding to wildfires. Another $10 million for agreements with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to establish and operate a program that makes use of geostationary operational environmental satellite programs, which is easy to say, for rapid detection and to report wildfire starts. There's also $5 million for purchasing sensors, cameras, and equipments for wildfire detection and real-time monitoring. The wildland firefighter workforce reforms, the law provides $120 million to Department of Interior for federal wildland firefighter workforce reforms, including base pay increases, creation of a wildland firefighter occupational series, the conversion of seasonal wildland firefighters to full-time permanent status, and the development of programs to address firefighter mental health and post-traumatic stress disorder care. In fuels management, the law provides $100 million for mechanical thinning, $250 million for prescribed fire, $250 million for developing and installing potential control locations, including fuel breaks, $100 million to employ contractors, young adults, tribal nation youth, veterans, and others to remove flammable vegetation and produce biochar and other innovative wood products, and $178 million in additional funding for fuels management. Tribes may also be eligible for these resources to plan and implement fuels management treatments, and the focus of these funds is to protect vulnerable communities from wildfire while preparing our natural landscapes for a changing climate. Burned area rehabilitation, we received a ton of funding in burned area rehabilitation, more than we even probably know what to do with right now. So this is a place that I'm pretty excited about being able to have some potential investments. Tribes are eligible for these funds provided for federal, state, and tribal entities to complete post-fire restoration activities, and these actions should help mitigate the damaging effects of wildfires and set landscapes on a path towards natural recovery and climate resilience. One of the topics that has been brought up to me a couple of times, especially, and Pete mentioned it too, and we could easily leverage some funding through the ecosystem restoration side of bill funding, is the expansion and creation of tribal nurseries and seed storage throughout the country. I think it's a great investment in local communities and tribal communities, providing jobs, providing infrastructure. So I've had some conversations with some person who's staring at me down there. And so that's something that I think is a really exciting opportunity for us. And we also have the Joint Fire Science Program. The law provides $10 million to DOI over the next 5 years for science and research associated with wildfire risk that directly impact local communities. The law also provided $10 million to the Forest Service for this program, so the Forest Service will administer that with us, jointly administer, co-manage, one might say. And then another thing is the Wildfire Commission. Some of you may be familiar with this. The commission is comprised of federal and non-federal stakeholders, including state, tribal, and other partners with expertise in all aspects of wildland fire management. The commission will make recommendations to improve federal policies relating to the prevention, mitigation, suppression, and management of wildfire and post-wildfire rehabilitation. The membership list is currently being finalized for White House approval with an anticipated announcement in June or July. And the first meeting is expected to take place in September. Mostly it's being pushed back just because we want to avoid the impending wildfire season. I think the commission is a really big opportunity. I was involved in some discussions yesterday about NWCG training requirements and the requirements for the cultural burns on tribal lands. I believe that the commission is a really good place to address some of those concerns and figure out ways that we can implement those ecological and the traditional burn programs on tribal lands without requiring some of those NWCG training requirements. So definitely a place for people to bring up some topics, and hopefully there's some folks here who are members who will be members of the commission, or that you know somebody who's a member of the commission. And that is really all I have. I'm a fast talker, and I only had a few slides. I do want to answer your question, Tim. So there's with wildland fire specifically, but with bill, so with bill funding, they are very project oriented. They really want to get money on the ground, get infrastructure projects on the ground. However, they are requesting, people are allowed to hire permanent staff with that bill funding. It gets a little bit tricky. I don't know how it works through Bureau of Indian Affairs and with tribal staff, but it is 5-year funding, so there would need to be base funding in the future. However, through wildland fire, there have been increases in the base funding. So you were talking about preparedness specifically. There have been increases in the 22 budget, and there were requested increases in the 23 budget. So that those base increases are coming through the different appropriations, but the bill funding is really more project oriented and getting funding on the ground.
So the funding you're talking about here from the
So there's two different parts to it. So I'll talk more. So the question was, for those of you who couldn't hear, is am I talking about the preparedness side here with wildland fire? This specifically, the numbers I just gave are bill funding. However, the omnibus had additional funding for preparedness and fuels projects within DOI that went out to the bureaus. And we do have budget request increases in out-year budgets. And so that would be what increases the actual baseline for wildland fire management. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So the next question is, does that mean that
Hopefully at some point as we continue to increase those budget opportunities, yes. Some of the preparedness this year is mostly focused on that workforce reform. But in future years, if we can continue to be successful in those budget requests, then yes, the bottom line is that tribes should be able to see increases, or they'll at least come through BIA.
Yeah, because those increases haven't happened. There's a lot of conversation about it. And we talked about it yesterday.
Yeah.
They haven't been increased for anything significant.
Yes, and the for better or for worse, wildland fire is really a point of attention out in Washington, D.C. There's a lot of conversations, and so I think that there's a couple of things that are going to come out of bill, as well as unfortunately increased wildfire seasons, is that we will be receiving more funding. I think that we'll see, as we make these investments and actually increase our output on fuels treatments and reduce wildfire risk, then I think Congress will continue to invest in those programs. So, sorry, I know I was supposed to wait to answer questions. I'm sorry.
Yeah, hi, my name's Ryan Sage, Yakima. And so you said that you're moving 50 million over to the USDA slip-on units and pickups, and the tribes apply for grants. Why wouldn't you just move the money directly to the IA to upgrade in 3 years, 12, 53?
So it's because it's specifically a grant program. Well, I guess I don't know the answer to that question. I don't want to say I don't want to give you an answer that I don't have all of the information on. What I can tell you is that we had POC groups that put together the suggestions for how we move these funds. And specifically with the slip-on tanker units, although it hasn't been fully approved yet, they are talking about moving it to a program that already exists rather than having to create a new grant program. Part of the problem with it's not a problem, but part of the process for wildland fire funding is it comes through Office of Wildland Fire. We don't have grant programs, so it would have to go to the Bureau anyway. And so having those grant programs that already exist made it a lot easier, because it could be up to 6 months to a year before we could ever get that funding pushed out if we didn't use already existing programs. That doesn't mean that we won't adapt and adjust over time. It's just to get funding out soon so that people can take advantage of it. We wanted to get those funds someplace that they could be used. Any other questions? Yes.
I was just going to say it's a whole lot easier doing grant proposals.
That's good to know. That is good to know.
Especially up here in Alaska, there is no Forest Service land down southeast Alaska, central Alaska, and a lot of the communities and tribes up here off the road system. So basically, their fire department are supposed to come through the Helitack units.
All right, that's good. I'm gonna take this information back. Like I said, nothing's set in stone. Everything's adjustable. And I think Pete also mentioned this came kind of fast. I mean, we knew it was coming, but we didn't know what it was gonna look like. And so a lot of this is just us building the plane while we're flying it.
You mentioned the funding is going to be available until expended, so I'm curious about implications of carryover that's plaguing the BIA right now. How carryover.
So the question for those of you that couldn't hear is, because the funding is available until expended, what does that mean as far as carryover, and what does that look like? We don't ever like carryover, to be honest. But in this particular situation, especially like if you look at fiscal year 22, we haven't gotten the allocations out to the bureaus yet. We're still working on the memo. It has to go through Office of Management and Budget, which was a twist that we weren't expecting. So we know that we're not allocating out all of the funds this year. And I think that there's an expectation in even, I don't know if anybody read our 5-year monitoring and maintenance treatment plan. It was a work of art. But we talk about how things will be, they're going to look different in 22 and 23 than they do in out years. And so I expect that we will see some carryover in these first 2 years. But then as we start really implementing the programs and getting more funding on the ground, I don't know that we're going to run the risk of necessarily having carryover. The highlight to that is that because it's know your funding I'm a budget geek, so it's know your funding, that if we do have funding left over after the 5 years, they're not just going to pull it back. We can continue to use it and put that on the ground. I can't speak for the carryover for BIA, but I can tell you that we do need to work to get it obligated. I mean, that's the simplest answer, and I will, in my position, do anything I can to help you all spend it. Yes?
Follow-up question to that. So once it's available, you guys can spend it as you have a budget now. So you won't have to wait for additional special appropriations that will come out in March or that pass on unless there's CR. It's to July to the actual tribes or agencies with the FDMS shut off of August.
You just reminded me of the question I meant to ask our budget officer before I left, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to have a really good answer for you, but what I can tell you is that the funding is already authorized, and so we just have to go through what's the apportionment process. Unlike, I think USDA got all of their funding up front, DOI, it's coming through the apportionment process, and so we'll get new funds every single year. But I don't think, because it doesn't have to go through the appropriations process, I don't think we have to wait until like March. I'm assuming that it will come through quicker, but I don't have the real answer, so don't, hopefully this isn't being recorded, but I will get that answer for you and we can share it more broadly. My understanding is that it does come out, it will be a faster process because it doesn't have to go through the appropriations process every year. But I could be wrong. Sometimes I am. I was right twice on Friday, and I made sure my older sister realized that. To all the older sisters in the room. Yes, there's one question in the back.
I've sat in a few of these meetings, both infrastructure funding and everything. What I get out of it, hear about tribal forestry program.
So the question for those of you who didn't hear it is a hard question. How is this information going to trickle down more to the local level? I can only, so I'm unfortunately at the highest levels of the organization. I get information out by being invited to meetings like this and talking to people. However, I also know that there are a lot of people who work for the Bureau of Indian Affairs in this room right now, and it's upon them and me to make sure that this information is shared and trickles down. I agree. There's so much money out there. There's so many opportunities. If you go to the White House infrastructure law page and look at all of the opportunities out there, it goes on for pages and pages and pages. A few weeks ago, I was in Anchorage for the Murkowski Symposium on bill, and there were, I don't even know how many vendors, a huge room full of vendors that all had infrastructure law funding that was associated with them. So I absolutely get where you're coming from. And I would push the folks here, and as well as those, my coworkers over from USDA, to make sure that we do share that information all the way down through the regional offices and to the local level.
I had a question about fuels.
Yes,
So,
an easy question.
well, maybe I'm just not understanding it, but you said there's 878 million over 5 years for fuels management. Is that just DOI or is that?
That is just DOI. So 878 million for fuels in just DOI.
And then how is that, are you allocating it like lump sum to different agencies to figure out how to distribute it? Like how does a tribe get that money from BIA and BIA get certain allocations? Tribes need in the big.
So the question is, how does the funding, the fuels funding, get split out? So there's multiple parts to that question. The fuels funding, we have different purposes within the infrastructure law, and so the 878 million over the 5 years is going to go to fuels management projects on the ground. However, and my friend Daryl, who's terrified of me now, is a big fan. He mentioned this yesterday, and it made my heart swell. NIFPORS, which I know is the National Fire something. I don't know what the acronym stands for, but that's where all the fuels treatments should be. And that is what feeds into the project list for fuels management. However, there are also established allocation methodologies and percentages for each of the bureaus based on conversations and meetings and stuff that have happened over the years. I know those percentages have changed a little bit in 2021 based on some reevaluations that they did. And so I don't remember if BIA got a little bit of a bump. I'd have to go back and look, but that's how the funding gets released, is based on those percentages. Having said that, if there are specific projects that we can fund that are not part of those appropriations or part of those allocations, then we'll do it. I mean, we're open to getting money on the ground and doing good things, and we're not opposed to other projects that don't fall into the NIFPORs.
So does the NIFPORS, that's a prioritization system for where money should go on criteria?
So you're getting into some areas that I probably am not going to be able to speak to as well, but NIFPORS is the program that is used in Department of Interior to track projects and treatments that will be taking place. And so right now we have projects in there for 22, which is what the funding's going out for, and then there should be projects in there for 23 and 24. And so that's just, it's the project management database where they put in the projects and then they mark all the boxes if it's, cleared NEPA or, what the impacts are on there.
Well, thank you, Ketti. That was great. I know that these are big numbers and very new programs and activities that the department is trying to get out the door. So I know ITC in particular will continue to help bridge that gap and facilitate discussions and get your questions answered. Our final panelist, Reed Robinson, is the Director of the Office of Tribal Relations for the USDA Forest Service. As Director, he supervises the Tribal Relations Program in Washington, D.C. and provides leadership for all the regions, research stations, and forest-level tribal liaison functions. Robinson's a member of the Rosebud Sioux Tribe, the Sichangu Lakota Oyate. His leadership journey includes 30 years with the National Park Service at 9 unique park units, where his duties range from historic building preservationist to National Park Superintendent. So please give Reed a round of applause, and I look forward to hearing what his favorite band is today. Thanks, Reed.
Has anybody heard of Armin van Buren? Armin van Buren? Dead Mouse? How about a genre? Trance? Techno? So I too was a child of the 80s, but gotta move on. We did. We did. We're both wearing black, though.
DOI is taking all their money back.
I want to thank everybody for being here, and the Intertribal Timber Council for the invitation, and the tribes and the Athabascan people for the hospitality. So there's going to be some repetition here, and I'm going to give you a couple of references. Hopefully it'll help you as you dig into the statute. There's two sections in the statute I'm going to talk about, and there's section 40803 and 40804. And you can see in there, as you go back in there, some of the items I'm talking about and where we're drawing our policy discussions. So April 20th, April 21st, the Forest Service held a national level consultation on the BIL. And the comment period closed on May 6th. Very short period. And I will give you my contact information, some contact information, because we will accept additional comments. And they'll be dated, so these things are important. And I understand that it was a very short period to turn around comments. So was anybody here able to attend those 2 days of consultation on the 20th and 21st? All right. One, I know a couple others from ITC attended as well, so this will be somewhat germane new information. There's a lot of large dollar figures in here, and I'm going to give you somewhat of a truncated verbatim articulation of what was said during those 2 days of consultation. So bear with me, please. The Forest Service received a total investment of almost $5.5 billion for fiscal years 2022 and 2026. The BIL also makes funding and opportunities available to tribal communities to support building resilience to wildland fire and drought, restoring ecosystems, and investing in all manner of business to utilize wood for these activities. Much of the bipartisan infrastructure, I'm just going to say bill from now on. Much of the BIL, section 40803 focuses on wildfire risk reduction and ecosystem restoration activities, with nearly $700 million available in funding for improvement of fire regime condition class, pre-fire planning, mechanical and pre-commercial thinning, prescribed fire, fuel breaks, and innovative wood products. The ecosystem restoration section of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law bill authorized over $2 billion between USDA and DOI to implement a diverse set of ecosystem restoration-related activities, recreation site management, and collaborative forest landscape restoration programs. The agency is still compiling feedback from the recent tribal consultation sessions to inform the allocation process. In FY22, funding is being held for allocation pending additional discussions with the regions and tribal partners with a plan to move forward with spending in the first part of FY23. In partnership with the Intertribal Timber Council, there are some additional engagement sessions in late May and early June in the form of a series of 1.5-hour mini workshops to bring together forest and tribal partners who have existing TFPA agreements or are working towards codifying agreements. Experts in grants and agreements, NEPA, etc., will be available to help answer questions with an intent to help catalyze projects for FY22 and FY23. Any events? Who does? So I'm going to go through about 10 sections here. And here's some of the dollar amounts associated with these sections. Community wildfire defense grants, firewood banks, temporary water crossing structures, hazardous fuel reduction. So these first three are available to the broader public, states and whatnot. And as we get into, obviously, hazardous fuel reduction, it'll be more travel specific. And then we'll close out with reverse 911. Community wildfire defense grants. So this is in section 40803F and D2. It makes $1 billion available to the Secretary of Agriculture to provide financial assistance to at-risk communities, including Indian tribes, to develop or revise a community wildfire protection plan and to carry out projects described in the community wildfire protection plan that is not more than 10 years old. This is a new program established in section 40803C12 and F of the bipartisan of the bill, with a total appropriation of $1 billion over 5 years. Funding limitations and requirements. So for the development of community CWPPs, you're limited to $250,000. Carrying out wildfire mitigation projects described in a CWPP, you're limited to $10 million. The bill requires that a priority be given to areas with a high or very high wildfire hazard potential. 2, low-income communities, or 3, a community impacted by severe disaster. Communities that receive grants must have adopted a roof construction ordinance or regulation. The bill provides 100 days to establish this program. Grants to tribes will be awarded directly by the Forest Service. Grants to other communities will be awarded via state forest agencies. The bill, section 40803C17, $8 million shall be made available to the Secretary of Agriculture of each of fiscal years 22 to 26 to provide feedstock to firewood banks, and B, to provide financial assistance for the operation of firewood banks. Firewood banks offer short-term heating materials, wood, to directly help people struggling to pay for home heating fuels, and also offer options for landowners seeking to remove and dispose of cordwood. Program implementation varies across the country and is often managed by nonprofit organizations, but there's potential for tribes to act as providers of heating fuels. Implementation of this program may include a focus on developing programs to support safety and clean burning of firewood. It's further expected that implementation will be done through block grants to organizations throughout the United States. You know, when I saw this in the bill, I was really intrigued, and it took me back to, those of you that work with, the IRFL program that the Federal Lands Highways program does. I think in addition to forestry, severe storm conditions also sometimes can rely on these temporary bridge crossings. So this is a new program established in section 40803 of the bill, but the total appropriation oh, wait a minute, sorry. Bill Section 4804, 50 million shall be made available to the Secretary to award grants to states and Indian tribes to establish rental programs for portable skidder bridges, bridge mats, or other temporary water crossing structures to minimize stream bed disturbance on non-federal and federal land. All states and many tribes with active forestry programs have a written set of best management practices that pertain to portable stream crossings, but fewer than 25% of these states and tribes have active programs to provide temporary structures for crossing streams during logging operations. This is primarily due to a lack of funding to purchase and maintain bridges and pay personnel to effectively administer the program. The states that do have active programs have been able to receive grant funding to implement a program. Existing programs utilize a combination of steel bridges, or timber bridge mats. There's a strong desire amongst interested parties in the establishment of a program to ensure that temporary bridges are available to ensure loggers have available options to readily comply with federal and/or BMPs. Hazardous fuel reduction through TFPA. The bill's section Division J, National Forest System, up to $8 million from hazardous fuel reduction funds shall be made available for the implementation of Tribal Forestry Protection Act, TFPA. Funding to support the development of enhanced TFPA workshop, utilization of 638 agreements for hazardous fuel reduction projects, and the establishment of education and training opportunities to strengthen tribal workforce capacity. Tribal proposals must focus on Forest Service lands that border or are adjacent to tribal lands, pose a fire, disease, or other threat to the Indian trust land community, or is in need of restoration, not be subject to some other conflicting agreement or contract, and involve a feature or circumstance unique to the proposing tribe, such as a legal, cultural, archaeological, historical, or biological connection. Specific consideration can additionally be given to the cultural, traditional, and historical affiliation of the Indian tribe with the land subject to the proposal, the treaty rights or other reserved rights of the Indian tribe related to the land subject to the proposal, and the indigenous knowledge and skills of the member of the Indian tribe. The Forest Service may utilize an array of appropriate instruments to enter into contracts and agreements with tribes to further the TFPA, including TFPA 638, Good Neighbor Authority, and stewardship contracting. Restoration work under TFPA and GNA. You know, if you're doing like some kind of a search or something on the internet and you come across this number in this section 4804, and in it says $168 million for Good Neighbor Authority, the reason why, and you got to check to make sure that TFPA is included in there, because there was a document circulating the government that didn't have TFPA on it. So everybody thought that this $160 million was specifically only for Good Neighbor Authority. So this $160 million shall be made available to the Secretary to award grants to states and Indian tribes for implementing restoration projects on federal land pursuant to GNA or TFPA 638 agreements. The Forest Service seeks feedback from tribes on ways they would be interested in restoration and wildfire mitigation work on National Forest System land. In the near term, we'll be looking to fund existing TFPA agreements or projects that can be shovel-ready in fiscal year 22 or early fiscal year 2023. Additional tribal consultation will occur to determine tribal interests and priorities for collaborative co-stewardship restoration work that can be funded throughout fiscal years 23 and 26. The Forest Service will also seek to support tribal capacity building and natural resource work that meets the intent of the bill and the future of cross-boundary restoration work. Recreation Site Restoration and Management. Bill, Section 4804 again, 35 million shall be made available to the Secretary to restore, prepare, or adapt recreational sites on federal land, including Indian forest land or range land that have experienced or may likely experience visitation and use beyond the carrying capacity of the sites. The Forest Service is encouraging tribes to engage with the local, national forests and grasslands and regional offices on possible projects that may qualify for funding under the bill. Recognizing constraints of time and other tribal priorities, the Forest Service is also directing local Forest Service units to consult with interested tribes to identify eligible projects. Reverse 911. Again, in 4803, $30 million is available to the Secretary of Agriculture to provide financial assistance to state Indian tribes and units of local governments to establish and operate reverse 911 telecommunication systems. Ten initial landscapes. Wildfire risk reduction. 10 initial landscapes in 8 western states, Washington, Oregon, California, Idaho, Montana, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, for resilient landscape projects where collaboration has already occurred for years. Fire doesn't impact the things we care about in a catastrophic way. 16 million acres. Of 16 million acres, 7 million fall within high-risk firesheds, areas that have a risk impacting communities, community infrastructure, and species habitat. Fuel reduction activities are supposed to be designed around reducing exposure to communities. Cross-boundary projects have cohesive partnerships, conducting field trips to understand values, practices, and learn from one another to reach outcomes. Customized approach using prescribed fire, mastication, thinning, timber thinning and harvest, road improvement, fuel breaks, and cultural burning. Opportunities to use TFPA and 638 contracts to go on field trips to incorporate practice into prescribed fire implementation. Burned area recovery. The DOI has a burned area rehabilitation program for many years, but this is a new process for the Forest Service. The Forest Service will follow the DOI outline since their program is well established and has already worked out a number of associated issues. BAR includes post-fire efforts taken within 3 years of wildfire containment to repair and improve lands that are unlikely to recover naturally to a management-approved condition. Also includes direction to repair or replace minor infrastructure and facilities damaged by fire. BAR actions go beyond that of the burned area emergency response, which requires action within 1 year and allows the agency to respond to burned areas for longer periods of time. BAR is a bridge to connect emergency response to longer-term recovery goals. The bill allocates $325 million for FY 22 to 26. And lastly, collaborative aquatic landscape restoration. The bill, section 4804, created B10, created the collaborative-based aquatic focus landscape scale restoration program. That's quite a sentence. Collaborative-based aquatic focus landscape scale restoration program. Restore water quality and fish passage on federal land, including Indian forest land or range land. $80 million will be made available to the USDA for fiscal year 2022 to 26 for or used in coordination with DOI. Guidelines require solicitation of proposals that are 5-year restoration projects to restore fish passage or water quality, have a million cost of $500,000 and a maximum cost of $5 million. Include proposed accomplishments and proposed non-federal funding amounts. Being accountable with the money we spend, plans need to include accomplishment and an estimate of non-federal funding that will also be used. Plans are intended to be collaborative, working with other federal agencies, including tribes. Proposals submitted to the Forest Service are prioritized based on most miles of stream restored for the lowest amount of federal funding. This is an impetus to get other partners to bring in other funding. Discontinues funding for projects that fail to achieve results as stated in the proposals. So I got some good information here on some comments based upon the consultation we occurred. How are we doing on time? So without going in some of the some of this other technical details, I'm just going to provide you some of the comments as a result of the 2 days of consultation. And some of these comments might be yours. Tribes need flexibility in reporting due to unforeseen circumstances, i.e. Mexican spotted owl injunction in New Mexico. Forest Service needs to form teams that include decision makers and subject matter experts who can sit down with tribes in a workshop style setting, discuss projects, and come out with a signed agreement. Better coordination across staffs at the Forest Service to help make projects happen. Another one, cross-boundary cooperation that goes beyond just providing funding, such as allowing tribes to use federal lands to establish operations bases and seasonal housing to accomplish projects. Another one, disconnect in TFPA between what is said during national consultation and what local staff see as possibilities. That's what I'm for. If you're not seeing, a through line from the top of the agency down to the field, then you need to call me. Because when we have consultation, sovereign to sovereign, the intent is to push it down. This is not ground. This is not like organically coming from the ground. This is sovereign discussions and decisions that have already been made, and we need to push it down. ITEK is more than just plugging traditional knowledge into Western management. Tribes need to be able to drive management, incorporating sacred sites and TEK into preservation of cultural and sacred sites is of utmost importance to tribes. Another one, lack of Section 106 discussion is concerning. Would like to see more of these funds applied to Section 106 and NEPA review. Another one, need to find a way to build capacity in new tribes for developing grants. Another one, enhancing and expanding recreation is a big concern for Pacific Northwest tribes. Tribes would like to see more of a can-do attitude from the Forest Service instead of trying to make tribes fit into boxes of funding. Grant application process is burdensome and hard to understand. Would like technical assistance in the grant application process. Critical to apply ITK on the ground, restoration and mitigation activities. Native species need to be used in restoration. Like to see funding and develop technological tools to assist in project implementations. Would like to use fund to hire consultants with specific technical expertise. Issues with how underserved communities are defined, as many tribes would not fall into underserved communities using the current definition. Forest Service should find efficiencies and agreements by integrating multiple authorities into a truly negotiated agreement so that tribes don't have to keep renewing multiple agreements on a 5-year basis. So that is actually, in a nutshell, 2 days worth of consultation. I know that we are still awaiting some policy direction from NRE, so that's the Undersecretary area over the Forest Service and the department. But we're all waiting. And that first $8 million that I mentioned for wildfire. We're actively working on that right now and getting funding to tribes that already have projects in place. So also, I will provide you an email address to send your comments to, and I should get them, and we will respond to them and capture them for the record, for the consultation record. This is a 5-year process, so this is, when we start consulting in the Forest Service, it's the beginning of the conversation. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Reed. That was very helpful. And I think we've come to the end of our time, right on time. Do we have time for maybe one question or 2 questions for anyone?
I think we do.
Okay. I know we covered a lot of ground. Anyone have any big questions for any members of the panel?
Okay.
I had a question for Reed. The fuels funding that was set aside for the TFPA, can that go through Good Neighbor or other agreements? In Alaska, we don't really have any restricted land adjacent to the Forest Service, so we can't do 638 TFPA agreements with the Forest Service.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yes.
That was quick.
Yeah, this question, this for you also, Reed. Like Pete and Ketti, they kind of mentioned how some of this funding can be used to build capacity for workforce and everything. We have a couple of TFPA projects that we have at the Leech Lake Reservation that are beyond just a project, they're programmatic. Would we be able to tap into some of that $8 million to build some personnel capacity to make sure these projects are being done on Forest Service lands adjacent to the tribe?
As Director of the Office of Tribal Relations, I will say unbold, not capitalized, yes. So, but please send me an email so I can get that information to Alyssa Tanner, who is distributing that funding. And she's a good ally. She's a good ally. I just met her over in FAM, and you know, she's really collaborative. So please send me your information from Leech Lake. Sure. Thanks again, everybody.
Well, thank you, everybody, for your time and participating in this panel. I hope it was helpful and at least starts your thinking process for projects that you may want to pursue. Like I said at the outset, I don't think there's ever going to be this kind of federal funding for these types of projects again, or at least there won't be if we don't make good use of the funds that have already been allocated. So thank you very much, and please feel free to grab the panelists later and follow up with questions or with ITC. Thank you.